Until Abhishek comes alive in terms of his audio, let me first of all, of course, welcome you all. Abhishek, are you there? Yeah. Let me welcome all of you, and we have a audience of 169 and adding on. And the only rule of this Zoom meeting is that please, until you're invited to speak, could you all keep your audios muted and videos on. Videos on is a security requirement so that we know that there are people behind those walls. We are not asking you to identify yourself, just keep your...
Sir,
yes,
sir,
sir.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Start, please. I just made the reference about keeping your audio muted. That's it. Please, Abhishek, take over.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to all of you. Welcome you all in today's webinar on pandemic and securitization, exploring binaries and paradoxes, organized by Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, JNU. This is the continuation of our Wednesday webinar series. Let me begin by the introduction of our center, CPOT. This is one of the oldest as well as largest center of the School of International Studies. The center came into existence when the Indian School of International Studies merged with JNU in 1970. We are focusing on politics, theory, organization, diplomacy, security, and geopolitics. In CPOT, there are distinct but linked programs of study like international politics, international organization, diplomacy and disarmament, and political geography. In today's webinar, we have two eminent thought leaders of international relations. For today's discussion, we invited Professor Varun Sahni for dialogue with Professor Amitabh Mattoo. Professor Varun Sahni, at present, he is Vice Chancellor of Goa University. He is former Vice Chancellor of University of Jammu, and most importantly, he is from our CPOT family. He is Professor of International Politics, School of International Studies, JNU. He has been visiting professor at National Defense University, Washington, D.C., under the Fulbright Military Academy Initiative, and the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy, the Australian National University, Canberra. He serves on the editorial board of the Chinese Journal of International Politics, Oxford University Press, Asian Security Series, Stanford University Press, Contemporary Politics, Taylor and Francis, and International Studies Quarterly. He was chairman of the Program Committee of Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, and the member of FISC Advisory Board of the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. For his outstanding contribution to research and teaching, he was conferred the VKRV Rao Prize in Social Science for 2006 by the Indian Council of Social Science Research. He has published many books and research articles on various issues of international politics. Welcome you, sir. The other eminent personality is Padma Shri Professor Amitabh Mattoo. He is professor at CPOT, School of International Studies, JNU, and honorary professor of international relations at University of Melbourne. He is also chairman of Governing Council of Miranda House, University of Delhi. He is former Vice Chancellor of University of Jammu. He was cabinet rank advisor of Jammu Kashmir government. He was member of National Security Advisory Board of Government of India. He was also member of the National Knowledge Commission, a high-level advisory group of the Prime Minister of India. He has been visiting professor at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, programs on arms control, disarmament, and international security at the University of Illinois, and many others. He has been published several books and many research articles. He writes regularly for many Indian newspapers, and we can watch him on national and international scale. Currently, he is president of Indian Association of International Studies and member of Governing Council of PAGWA Conference on Science and World Affairs, the Nobel Prize winning NGO which campaign for global disarmament. Welcome you, sir. I also welcome our center chairperson, Professor Varun Sahni, my senior colleague, Professor Rajesh Rajgopalan, Professor Jayati Srivastav, Dr. Mausmi Basu, Dr. Archana Negi, Dr. Manish Dabhade, Dr. Krishnan Meena, and Dr. Santana Khanikar. Now I request Professor Mattoo to initiate the dialogue. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Abhishek, for those very kind words. And before I begin by inviting Professor Varun Sahni to speak and have this conversation with me, may I request for 2 minutes, a few minutes, your indulgence. There are students of our center who have started an initiative, digital publication called Mandala, which we hope that all of us, faculty members and students of IR, will support. And Pooja Arora will give a short, brief introduction to this journal. Pooja, your time starts now.
Yes, sir. I'm starting with the video. You've disabled participant screen sharing, so we'll do the video later. Thank you, Professor Mattoo, Professor Sahni, for giving me this opportunity. My esteemed professors and fellow scholars, let me start by stating how greatly honored I feel to be given an opportunity to present the concept and idea of Mandala in front of the stalwarts of Indian academia. This innovative magazine has been conceived with the aim of gathering the opinions and ideas of eminent scholars and thought leaders on one platform and communicating those ideas to the largest number of people in the hope that it will have a positive impact in making society a better place to live. It is not just a magazine, it represents the belief in a better future. The world is changing and it is changing fast. We're in the middle of a pandemic that has shocked the system and caused unacceptable fatalities across the world. Today, our nation stands at the cusp of a new world that needs to be brave and face fresh debates that cannot be defined in the traditional paradigm of the left and the right, but depend upon the priorities we choose as a collective. This is the moment where everything around us changes. From our dependence on bits and bytes to molecular biology, from a faulty multilateralism to a multilateralism that works for everyone. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shape the world that we want to live in by innovating aggressively. And that is what Mandala is all about. Today, we need to come out of the tight bounds of specialization to ensure vertical progress in ideas, to build an equitable future based upon a unique Indian vision. The infrastructure of these ambitions is our will to have a conversation with people on either side of the host muted me for a second.
Yeah.
The greatest task in today's world is not to oppose the majority, but to think for yourself, to have a vision and to be able to articulate that vision. It is time to be courageous as public intellectuals and give voice to the brilliance that lies at the heart of our nation's youth. A youth that is dedicated to saffron, white, and green and is guided by the wisdom of this country's greatest contemporary thinkers. To those listening to me intently, if you are as passionate to create a new vision for this country, please join us in this endeavor. Watch out for our first issue where we explore the fallout of the coronavirus from an Indian perspective. All contact information will be posted in the chat box. If the host could please enable screen sharing, I could start the promo video. Abhishek sir. Could the host please Enable screen sharing, SIS JNU host.
And in case that doesn't happen in the next minute, what we'll do is towards the end of the webinar, we'll post that video as well. And Abhishek, I can't see you. I can't even see Varun at the moment, but I imagine that.
I think they've to.
I'm here, Amitabh, very much so.
Okay. Pooja, I would suggest that we'll post the video towards the end of once we've concluded the conversation, the dialogue.
Right, sir.
So there is
Thank you.
Yeah, if you can mute yourself now. Now, let me just add my words of welcome to Varun. Varun is, and we decided consciously to speak to each other in terms of our first names, because that reflects one, a collegiality between us. We've been colleagues for about 25 years. We've been friends for 35 years. So we bring that collegiality and that friendship and fellowship to this dialogue. I'm really more of an impresario, which is I will raise the questions, and Varun is going to engage with the questions. And we had a short discussion yesterday on how we could format this discussion. We decided that the idea, that the theme of his presentation is pandemics and securitization, exploring binaries and paradoxes. So we could begin, we divide this into 4 sections roughly of 10 minutes each, and begin by first exploring the whole idea of securitization, then looking at pandemics, and then at pandemics past, present, and future, particularly in the context of COVID-19, and then look at the binaries and paradoxes that we are presented with. Now, when I joined JNU, around that time, or a little earlier than that, you had Kenneth Waltz's major work, The Theory of International Politics, being published. And that defined for many of us the state of the discipline. Some years later, you had Robert Cohen's edited volume, Neorealism and Its Critics, and that shaped the dominant discourse, the pages of many of the most prestigious journals in international relations for at least almost a decade. And then in the 90s, 98, I think it was, that you suddenly had the emergence of this new book written by Barry Buzan, Ole Weaver, and Japo Weil, called Security: A New Framework for Analysis. And that, as Ole Weaver himself pointed out, that since that time, any discourse on security almost constantly refers to that book or to that work of what began to be called the Copenhagen School, although Ole Weaver stayed on in Copenhagen, but Weil went to Groningen, and of course, Buzan is now emeritus professor at the LSE. What it did was really reshape our understanding of security from what some might crudely describe a constructivist point of view, but that security was not something out there, objective, but it was the securitizing actors who defined what that security was, what constructed, and there was an act of performativity, which, to use the words of Judith Butler, in that definition, in that description. And once you describe something as belonging to the realm of security, you exceptionalized it. You said that this was an area which demanded special measures, which demanded all sorts of emergency provisions, because there were issues which were almost national or societal or national at stake. And there was an audience which approved of this in an ideal world. So there was an object, there was an actor, and there was an audience. Since that time, the Copenhagen school branched out, or branched out is not the right word, but mushroomed into many other trees. There is the Aberystwyth School, the Critical Studies School, but the greatest challenge to the idea of how this whole securitization happens came from the Paris School and Thierry Balzac's work on securitization theory, how security problems emerge and disappear, of course, remains some of the most important work from a sociological perspective, and especially drawing from the speech action theory of Austin, who was a philosopher who wrote, as Oliver Weaver pointed out, just 8 articles in all his life, but made such a significant contribution to those articles that he still had an impact on the discipline. Where then does securitization today help us to understand the world that we see it? And beyond the Paris School of Sciences Po, or the Copenhagen School, or the Critical Studies School, and including philosophers like Judith Butler, who are more attuned to the idea of how this whole idea of constructing through speech a certain referral object itself is an act of performance, performability. Where does that leave the kind of bundle of security issues that we are confronted with? And was there, and is there, an Indian approach? About 20 years ago, all of us, and Professor Hiraman Tiwari is here, and Hiraman will remember that we looked at some of the ways in which security and security issues can be looked at from an Indian textual point of view. In fact, one of the great contributions of Hiraman Tiwari to my intellectual life, much before he became a star on Twitter, I knew him as a much more benign philosopher at Oxford, where he introduced me to a book or to a series of writings by Bimal Matilal. And one of the great essays was on In Defense of Devious Divinity, which looked at Krishna's dialogue with Arjuna and talked about how here was an ostensibly divine entity and yet was devious in many of his actions. And how could you encapsulate or this oxymoron of devious divinity? And I looked at it from a security point of view and the whole work of Mahabharata and that great war from a security point of view. Are some of those lessons important as we engage with issues of our time? And we're not really addressing right now the issues of the pandemic itself, because we'll come back to it. But Varun, it's over to you with these kind of preambular remarks that I have made for you to give us your wisdom, having written so extensively, thought so extensively about these issues.
Thank you, Amitabh, and good morning to everybody. It's lovely to be in a CPOD event, in a CPOD conversation. That has been essentially the bulk of my intellectual life, and you know, it's really, really great. And I thank all of you for inviting me, particularly Abhishek Srivastav. So what I'll do, Amitabh, I have, as you know, a formal presentation. We'll break that presentation up into bits as we go along. But let me start by sharing my screen and, you know, sort of getting started on the presentation. I'll stop at, you know, at critical points and then turn the conversation back to you. And that way, hopefully we'll be able to, you know, we'll be able to get something, something going. So I hope my screen can be seen by everyone. So let me start out by sort of laying out what I sort of think I would like to be talking about. Can you hear me?
We can,
Amitabh, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see the screen. Am I the only one who can't see the screen, or?
Can you,
We can see the screen also and hear, we can hear sir also.
Okay,
my screen should be there for everybody to see. I hope so.
So the screen is there, but not the sharing. Video sharing is not started yet.
no screen. So there's half of us who can see the screen and half who can't see.
Would you want me to, what I'll do is, I'll hold on until you solve the technical issue, because there's no point my going on and then sort of, that wouldn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, I mean.
So let me know when I can.
Yeah,
Share
Abhishek.
screen is not on.
Beg your pardon?
Professor Sahni, your screen sharing is not on. We can see you obviously, but not what you're sharing on screen.
Okay, are you able to, Varun, see your screen
Is
sharing?
anybody able to see my screen? Is anybody being able to see my screen?
No.
No, sir.
No, sir. No, sir.
Sir, you are visible, but your presentation is not visible. If you kindly...
Well, I think the reason for that is that then somebody has to enable my screen sharing.
Sir, the host has to make Professor Sahni co-host. Once he's made co-host, he can share the screen. Abhishek, can you please make Professor Sahni the co-host, and then he can immediately share the screen.
So there is no screen sharing. We can't see you, sir.
One second. If everyone please mutes yourself, we're just working on the technical issue. Professor Sahni, the other alternative is for you to send it to me, and I'll, is it a PowerPoint? Or to Abhishek, or to Manish, and then Manish, you can be made co-host. If that's, Abhishek, is there a problem?
It's a PowerPoint, I can certainly send it.
Abhishek?
Is Abhishek able to?
Abhishek, Professor Sahni ko co-host karo, and he can immediately share it. I can't see Professor Sahni as co-host. Can you make it right away? That's so simple. Mattoo Sahab, please, if you are also the co-host, can you please make...
I can't.
It's Abhishek. Abhishek co-host karo sir ko.
Sir, nothing is visible.
Yeah, it's on now.
Yeah, now it's on.
Yeah, Varun, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Can you all see? Can you all see
we
this
can
now?
see it. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Then let me then just a moment. We can get started then. I'm sort of hopefully all the participants can now see the screen in front of them, and what I'm trying to do sort of is pick up from where Professor Mattoo had left off, and Amitabh, you I think laid out quite well what sort of what the thinking is on sort of the whole securitization theory. I'll not be speaking about that in great detail, given that we have only a certain amount of time with us. But this is broadly speaking the way I've organized this webinar. So I'm going to sort of first talk a bit in this section about binaries, paradoxes, and securitization. And then later on, we'll move to other themes. We'll dwell a bit on the past by focusing on pandemics and other problems in the pre-2020 world, speculations about provenance, interrogations about predictability as far as COVID-19 is concerned. We'll then move on to sort of considering to some extent the present, namely in terms of the strategies to counter, mitigate, cope, and survive, as well as the existential impacts that we are seeing in this time of pandemic. And then wrapping it up, very briefly by sort of, well, tentative predictions, as it were, about what is likely to emerge in the future. So moving on then to the first bit, binaries, paradoxes, and securitization. I'm just very quickly going through basic definitions. If you use the word binary as a noun, it implies a division into two groups or classes that are considered diametrically opposed. If you use the word binary as an adjective, it is the use of stable oppositions to analyze a subject or create a structural model. The standard binaries of good, evil, global, local, nature, culture, patriot, traitor, and so on and so forth. So, these are very standard definitions. What is a paradox? Again, some standard definitions, again coming from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. A statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense, and yet is perhaps true. A self-contradictory statement that at first seems true. An argument that apparently derives self-contradictory conclusions by valid deduction from acceptable premises, and it could be also seen as a tenet contrary to received opinion. And since we are in the business at the moment of going through some standard definitions, what's a pandemic? Well, we can try to even sort of be clear about what we are speaking about. It actually derives from two other terms. An outbreak is a sudden rise in the incidence of a disease, typically confined to a localized area or a specific group of people. An epidemic is an outbreak of disease that spreads quickly and affects many individuals at the same time. An outbreak that becomes more severe and less localized. And a pandemic is an epidemic that has spread across a wider geographic range than an epidemic and which has affected a significant portion of the population. So moving on from the standard definitions of securitization itself. Well, as Professor Mattoo has already sort of indicated to us, in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a great deal of conceptual and theoretical effort to transcend traditional security studies. Traditional security studies, as we know, had for half a century focused on the state and its external security concerns, pretty much after the end of the Second World War, or even beginning with the Yechkar in the interwar years. And expanding security studies implied, at the minimum, adding non-state actors and the internal security realm to the traditional statist and militarist concerns of traditional security. And therefore, again, as you have indicated, Amitabh, two schools of security studies emerged. There were others later, the Paris school as well. One was critical security studies, Krause and Williams, and the other was, of course, the Copenhagen school, Busan, Weber, and De Wilde. And these were the most prominent in the initial years. And through a broad redefinition of security in terms of existential threats to any referent object, novel and exciting answers emerged to three basic questions: security for whom, security from what, and security at what cost. And from being the obvious and only answer to the first question, security for whom, the state often became the answer to the second question, which is security from what. So in a way, when you moved out of traditional security studies, the state became as much a threat to security of other referent objects as it was itself the object of security. And the state came to be viewed not as the sole referent object of security, but a frequent threat to the security of other referent objects. And while both schools supported a widening of the concept of security, they disagreed on as basic an issue as the conceptualization of security itself. So the Copenhagen school, conceived of security as a self-referential practice, because it is in this practice that the issue becomes a security issue. Not necessarily because a real existential threat exists, but because the issue is presented as a threat. And I'm quoting, of course, from the Busan, Weber, De Wilde book of 1998, Security, a New Framework for Analysis. And the critical security studies perspective holds that security is a derivative concept. It is in itself meaningless. To have any meaning, security necessarily presupposes something to be secured. As a realm of security, it cannot be self-referential. So right out there, as you can see, there is a fundamental difference. Is security self-referential or not? So securitization then at its simplest involves two intellectual and conceptual processes. The first is going beyond the state, focusing on non-state reference of security at varying levels of analysis, ranging from the individual human being to the planetary ecosystem. And the second is going within the state, not treating the state only as a unitary rational actor in the neorealist tradition. Amitabh, you mentioned walls, really the intellectual commanding heights of the discipline when we were first studying international relations. But going within the state is also about viewing the state in relation to society and social forces. So securitization then, what exactly is meant by the verb to securitize? In order to be securitized, an issue has to be presented as an existential threat demanding absolute priority and extraordinary treatment. That's the idea, right? But here's the thing. There is at the heart of it a paradox here. And the heart of it, there is a real slipperiness in the conceptualization. Because on the one hand, securitization can be viewed as an extreme version of politicization, whereby a public issue is presented as requiring total or exclusive political attention. But on the other hand, securitization can be seen as being opposed to politicization, inasmuch as a public issue is removed from the normal political bargaining processes. So it is therefore, as I said, a very slippery concept that contains within itself the diametrically opposed notions of total politics, hyper politics on the one hand, and on the other hand, no politics. So both of these notions are embedded in the idea of securitization. Another linked concept to this, and it's really important that we understand this, is the concept of desecuritization. Again, a concept that was placed, by Buzan, Weber, and De Wiel, which is this: the shifting of issues out of the emergency mode and into the normal bargaining processes of the political sphere. And so, my friends, this is what I would suggest this looks like. So any problem can be treated at three different levels. You can treat it as a technical problem. Let's say there's a scarcity of water, shortage of water in a city. You can see it purely as a technical problem, which is we don't have enough water. How do we resolve the problem? So a technical problem is essentially resolved by asking the question, how? How do we sort this problem out? Do we sort of drill for groundwater? Do we build a canal from a neighboring stream or river or what have you? However, a technical problem can become a political problem. It becomes a political problem when you stop asking a how question and start asking a who question. Imagine if all the students living in hostels in the city start protesting about the fact that they are not receiving water. So then the question becomes a who question. And as was told to us by Laswell, in 1923 in his book, Politics is about who gets what, when, and how. So the moment the question shifts from how to who, it becomes a political problem. But it could also become a security problem if it begins to be seen as an existential threat. And once it becomes a security problem, it's no longer a how or a who question. It then becomes a question of what, when, and where. That there is an existential threat. What is the nature of the threat? Where is it coming from? Where is it likely to impact on us? When is it likely to come? So this therefore is in a way the process of securitization, moving from a technical problem to a political problem to a security problem. And just as there is this process of securitization, there is a reverse process of desecuritization. That what is a security problem can be desecuritized and made a normal political problem, or a normal political problem can also be removed out of the realm of politics and made a technical problem. So when somebody pleads, let's not politicize this, let's depoliticize this, what they're essentially pleading for is removing politics out of a particular problem. What about that third question I had indicated? Security at what cost? Sometimes we just say security at any cost. That's our instinctive answer to the question, security at what cost? But I'll suggest to you that security at any cost is very often an unrealistic answer. And the reasons is that resources are always limited, and there are always multiple security threats and a whole range of other problems that any society has to confront. So let's just break it down in the following way I propose to you. You know, really, ultimately, whether we're talking about individual human beings or about social collectivities, that the three key drivers are, you know, the drive to survive, the drive to thrive, and the drive to be oneself, right? Security is the drive to survive, protection from existential threats. But we also have the drive to survive, the drive to thrive probably, excuse me, which is prosperity. So you can move from kind of a security argument to a prosperity argument, which is enhancement of well-being. And finally, there is also the drive to be oneself, which is in the realm then of identity, preservation of core values. So you know, instead of saying that it's always about security, to say that it's always about security is to view it in the following way, you know, pyramidically, that, you know, security is the base. Without security, you cannot have prosperity. Without prosperity, you cannot have identity. The other way to look at it is to see that they're all sort of, as it were, mutually implicating. So greater security leads to greater prosperity, leads to greater identity, which leads to greater security. So you can see it in terms of this mutual implicating, or you can also see it fundamentally as processes that overlap. You can see it almost as Venn diagrams that, you know, and of course, then the sweet spot is where security, identity, and prosperity intersect. That's where we as individual human beings would like to be. We would like to be safe. We would like to be well, you know, and we would like, obviously, to be ourselves. We wouldn't like to become Americans just because, you know, that gives us, as it were, greater prosperity. So that's why identity becomes critical as well. And you can see it in terms of a Venn diagram. So let me, Amitabh, take a pause at this point before I get into the next kind of part of the presentation, where, as I have indicated, we'll be talking a bit about sort of questions of the past. How were pandemics situated in terms of other problems, and then also sort of, you know, looking at it in terms of, you know, issues of provenance and prediction. So I'll stop here to let you guide us through the next part of my presentation. Over.
Thank you very much, Varun. That's extremely useful in terms of laying out the conceptual context within which we are framing our discussion and our conversation in terms of pandemics. Of course, as everyone knows, that this is not, this is probably the most severe, intense, and in terms of its spread, probably the most geographically widely spread pandemic that we have seen, but we have seen in the recent past itself, SARS, the avian flu, Ebola, Zika, and in the earlier part of the 20th century, you of course had the Spanish flu. The question really then, Varun, in terms of conceptualization as well as looking at pre-2020 world, was that there was in some ways a coalescing or a convergence between what you might think of as the classical school of security studies and the newer approaches in terms of recognizing pandemics as a threat. Whether you treated the state as the referent or you had a more decentered version of security, there was a recognition that pandemics could undermine both the state as well as, of course, individual human lives, societies, and the way we live. And since we'll go to COVID in the next section, but I thought maybe you could reflect on that. And when we come to COVID, then we could perhaps even focus on what now people like Nunes in York are talking about, that it's not just a crisis of neoliberalism as an economic model, but a crisis of neoliberalism itself, neoliberalism itself. given that neoliberalism rested on the primacy of the market, competition, minimal state intervention, and how this in some ways confronts that whole idea of neoliberalism. But we'll come back to that. I thought maybe you could, while you look at pandemics and other problems in the pre-2020 version, or perhaps address the idea of how, in any case, classical approaches, in some ways there was a convergence between a realist approach, a neorealistic approach, and the other more modern constructivist and critical approaches about pandemics, the challenge of pandemics being within the realm of security studies, as it were, a securitization of pandemics. Yeah, Varun, please.
Thank you for that, Amitabh. Very useful suggestions. In fact, I didn't mention when I began that this is actually what I'm sharing with colleagues at CPOD today, and of course other participants. Is work that I'm currently doing. I'm sort of actually trying to write a rather long piece on, in fact, precisely this theme. And sort of, therefore your remarks right now are actually quite helpful to me because that'll add some stuff there. So let me move on then and sort of, just look at this, pandemics and how pandemics is seen in the context of the pre-2020 world. Sort of, 30th November 2019. What did the world look like? And here's the way I see it. There were really, when you looked at problems in the world, when you looked at issue areas pertaining to international relations and world politics, you really could, categorize all of these problems into three groups, into three categories, if you will. The first of them were new problems. New problems were either problems being confronted for the first time, such as anthropogenic climate change, or problems being confronted for the first time in a globalized form. And this is where, epidemics and pandemics fit. In fact, I've been saying something like this for about, I think, 10 years now. I mean, there are, so the point is pandemics were always in that sense there, and they were always there at the back of one's mind. But the thing is that we never sort of ever brought them front and center as the core driver, of international politics. The solutions to these problems necessarily involve ingenuity, the ability to think out of the box, and novel approaches. So that's the first thing, new problems. The second are old problems that require new approaches and solutions because the old approaches no longer work. And here we have a raft of issues like world trade, urbanization, energy and resource scarcity. These are not by any means new problems, but pretty much the old approaches no longer yield solutions. And so for this bunch of issues, it was about trying to think out of the box because you actually needed to try to find new solutions. And the third is old problems with old solutions, but new actors. And here we have a range of traditional security issues, such as SLOCs, the sea lanes of communication, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, so on and so forth. Many of them traditional security issues, but issues that have been impacted by the ongoing hegemonic decline and power transition. So in the, the world as it was before we became aware that there was something called the coronavirus, which was causing a disease that came to be called COVID-19, there was, this was the way in which, it made sense to view problems. Moving on from that, Amitabh, to the next section, which sort of, I think links up with what I've just said. So let me go through this as well, and then I'll stop again. Is the sort of, speculations about provenance and also interrogations about predictability. So what does one mean by that? Where did the pandemic come from? That's the question. Where did the pandemic come from? And here we come up with kind of the first in binary, among the binaries I'll be sort of, laying out before you. The first binary is sort of the binary of naturally mutated versus artificially engineered. But I would suggest that there are, in fact, three possibilities here. And what are the three possibilities? The first is that the virus is the result of a natural mutation, perhaps due to human dietary consumption of exotic wildlife species, or the other possibility is that the virus was artificially engineered in a laboratory for some scientific research or application purpose. And the third would be that the virus was artificially engineered for biowarfare. I would suggest to you that it's still not clear which of these, but it's not in that sense, strictly speaking, a binary. Or if it is a binary, the artificial engineered part of that binary can itself be then broken down into another binary, which are points number 2 and 3. And for those of us interested in, the arms control and disarmament side of things, this, I would suggest, also explains why it is so difficult to arrive at a biological and toxin weapons convention, although a functioning chemical weapons convention already exists with its own organization and so on and so forth. Why is it so difficult to come up with a biological and toxin weapons convention that is robust? It is for the following reason. If you find there's existence of a molecule that is banned, you know for sure that that molecule has been artificially engineered. So somebody is breaking the chemical weapons convention. That's not true when it comes to a virus. You cannot be certain. You cannot be certain whether this is a virus that has been engineered or whether it's a virus that has mutated naturally in nature. And there have been other examples of this: the Hanta virus, for example, SARS, Ebola, and so on and so forth. So there always will be, every time a particularly lethal virus comes on the scene, there will always be speculation about whether it was artificially engineered, but there'll always be a doubt about whether, in fact, it could have naturally mutated. So so that's the question about provenance. Where did it come from? But there's the other question, which is the question of predictability. Could the pandemic have been foreseen? Now, this is a really interesting question, because over the past 3 or 4 years, I've been talking a fair bit, particularly in our military schools, on what I call the great disruptors. So in 2019, what was seen as the great disruptors, or at least at any rate seen as the great disruptors by me? The first of them were disruptive technologies. For example, new electricity storage of battery technologies. If they come into place, fundamentally the hydrocarbon economy gets problematized, and becomes less and less relevant. Secondly, ecosystem concerns, including global climate change. For example, again, the opening up of the resources in the tundra and navigation in Arctic waters. That would be, in every sense, a great disruptor. Third could be new networks of finance, production, and exchange. For example, a new global reserve currency and a new lender of the last resort. So I myself, as an analyst over the last few years, have sort of said, well, these are the sorts of great disruptors. Please note, I was not talking about pandemics. So that raises this fundamental question: could the pandemic have been foreseen? And here we come to this very remarkable man who I'm actually personally very fond of, although he's universally reviled, Donald Rumsfeld, who was, of course, US Secretary of Defense during the US invasion of Iraq. And this is what he said, for which he was widely pilloried. There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. There are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. And people said, what's this guy going on about? But actually, Rumsfeld takes this from a very ancient bit of wisdom from Iran, of all countries, Persian wisdom. He who knows and knows not that he knows, he is asleep, wake him. He who knows and knows that he knows, he is wise, follow him. He who knows not and knows not that he knows not, he is a fool, shun him. He who knows not and knows that he knows not, he is ignorant, teach him. So this is, in fact, very ancient Persian wisdom. And sort of, in a way, what Rumsfeld was saying was very much, in fact, aligned to this. So one way of not just parodying or pillaring Rumsfeld is to sort of see whether there's any wisdom there. And I would suggest that there is. This is the known-unknown matrix, also known as the Johari window, much beloved of psychologists and psychoanalysts. But here is what it is. If you were to have a 2x2 matrix of known and unknown, and I'm using here examples from international security because that's the field that I personally negotiate, you can have a known, such as the relative decline of US global hegemony. We know it's going to happen, and we can probably see it happening. Then you can have a known unknown, which is the moment when China will decisively take on or confront the United States. We know it's going to happen. There's a kind of a sense of inevitability about it, but we don't know when it'll happen, right? Then you have what are the unknown knowns. The unknown knowns are, for example, extremists taking control of Pakistani nuclear weapons. That for me would be a classic example of an unknown known. And then there are the unknown unknowns, which would be again from international security, an example, an extraterrestrial invasion from beyond the solar system. So if that were to happen, if suddenly little green men were to emerge with very kind of lethal weapons, that would be genuinely an unknown unknown. Now just keep this the Johari window in mind. The Johari window, incidentally, is created by Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingham, and they use the two first names, Joseph and Harrington, to come up with the word Johari. What is an unknown unknown? An unknown unknown is a black swan event, namely catastrophes with massive consequences that are so rare and unthinkable, they cannot be prepared for because they cannot even be imagined. That is a black swan event. We know why it's called a black swan, right? Because the Europeans always thought that swans were white until Captain Cook in Tasmania discovered black swans. So, that's the black swan problem. It's the problem of induction in philosophy, Hume's problem, so on and so forth. Won't get into any of the stuff. But that's what when you talk about a black swan event, this is what we are talking about. Catastrophes with massive consequences that are so rare and unthinkable, they cannot be prepared for because they cannot even be imagined. Going back to my example of the extraterrestrial invasion from beyond the solar system. But then you also have your unknown known. This is what is called a gray rhino event. And the term gray rhino comes from a wonderful book written in 2016 by Michelle Booker called The Gray Rhino. I recommend it to all students of international politics and security. But what is a gray rhino? She says a gray rhino is a threat that ought to be seen, but often is not, or seen but willfully ignored. That's an unknown known. So this is something that, really we should have known about. When it happens, you almost shrug your shoulders and say, well, yeah, it was bound to happen. Think about my example of extremists taking over Pakistani nuclear weapons, for example. When it happens, we're all going to say, well, it was bound to happen. If you have terrorists and nuclear weapons geographically co-located, the likelihood of that happening at some moment is always going to be high. At a particular moment in a particular context, that could happen. Or think about the 2008 financial collapse, for example. In retrospect, everybody could see that the way the U.S. property market had developed, was bound to happen. So the thing about gray rhinos is, after the event happens, everybody says, oh, well, that was obvious, right? But until it happens, you don't think about it. The 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers would be another example of potentially a gray rhino event. So that leads, in fact, to binary 2 that I would suggest to you, which is, black swan, gray rhino. When we think about COVID-19, when we think about this particularly, infectious coronavirus, is it a black swan event? Is it a gray rhino event? I think that's the second binary. I will stop at this point, Amitabh, so that you can take the story forward. The next 2 sections are sections where I'll be, focusing on binaries and paradoxes as they pertain to, strategies to counter, mitigate, cope, and survive. And sort of then, further on from that, looking at the existential impacts of COVID-19.
Yeah, I won't.
Let me stop here for you.
Yeah, no, Varun, that's again very, very thoughtful. So, and especially in terms of the examples that you give of the rhino and the black swan. And I won't stop in for too long. except to suggest, I mean, I call binaries in a more contemporary cultural sense Manichaean choices, given that China is the one who forces many of these binaries onto us. But when you deal with the crisis that has, for want of a better word, that COVID-19 has presented us with, perhaps you could actually look at how, in terms of how the vulnerabilities or what is defined as the precarity of large sections of people, including the collapse of the public health system and the stigmatization that's happening. I mean, how do you problematize these issues within security discourse? I mean, as I said, there is a critique of neoliberalism which is emerging, where people blame the panacea that markets were presented as a market providing solutions in terms of and how the retreat of the state was seen as almost given as a good. Given the circumstances that prevail now and the return of the state rather than the retreat of the state, what does it mean? I mean, I'm still also exploring and probing through all these issues of, and in fact, Varun, you'll be glad to hear that 2 weeks from now, we are going to have a seminar on precarity, pandemics and reflections on contemporary international relations. Precarity, of course, derived from Judith Butler's work, but with some of the most prominent thinkers on this subject. Ritu Vij, who was a senior in JNU, who's now a professor at Aberdeen and is on the editorial board of Alternatives, as well as Siddharth Malvarupu, our own former colleague at CPOD and now Professor Shiv Nadar, and Dr. Madan Mohan. They are going to reflect. In some ways, it's a good follow-up on the 8th of July to the conversation that we are having today. So, but perhaps this is not to in any way impose any kind of disciplinary limits on what you're going to speak, but in just to suggest that perhaps these are ideas which we need to explore, to problematize them within the security discourses that we are confronted with. I'll take your indulgence because Professor Hiraman Tiwari needs to leave soon, and I think he would want to make an intervention right now, and then we come back to you and will not interrupt you till you conclude your presentation. Hiramanji, Guruji, if you're there. Professor Hiraman Tiwari. Okay, I'll just read out what he said so that will conclude my interventions or Hiraman's, what he said, and I'll just say it and then we'll leave it to you, Varun, to conclude this presentation. Thank you for your reference to Matilal. The only point I would like to remind of that paper and others in the category that Matilal was critiquing in his own way the various epithets which the ill-informed Western scholars have tried to understand the role of Krishna, and one of was the devious god by a US Indianist, to which Matilal used for that paper. It was a sardonic title, but yes, I agree with your understanding of the Mahabharata on the concept of securitization. That in some ways, Matilal's critique of Krishna was in response to a much larger Western critique, so that needs to be contextualized. I completely respect that view here, Guruji, and now I'll leave it to Varun to make his presentation in terms of the binaries and paradoxes, and in some ways, perhaps normatively on the way forward.
Thank you, Amitabh, for those very thoughtful remarks, and very nice to know that that Hiraman, who's somebody else I can call with the first name because I've known him for a very long time, So thank you for those thoughts. I'm certainly intrigued by the 8th July event, and hopefully if somebody sends me an invitation, I'll try to sort of, be virtually present. That sounds really interesting. And here's the thing: the piece I'm working on is actually an attempt to unpack binaries. So this idea about as being Manichaean is not something that I would at all disagree with. And as I go through some of the other binaries, you will see that a lot of them could do with very significant unpacking. So let's start looking at them, shall we? What are the strategies to counter and cope? Well, obviously the first and that is our third binary, is flattening the curve, versus acquiring herd immunity. This has been there with us from the beginning. I mean, literally from the time the crisis began. These two terms have sort of been battling it out with each other. And in the biomedical sciences and in the in sort of public health circles, there are some raging debates going on right now in learned journals and in opinion sort of outlets on precisely these two strategies, which are very often being seen, in fact, as being diametrically opposed to each other. And one of the reasons for that is the fourth binary. Flattening the curve can also be seen as survival of the weakest. You want to flatten the curve to give everybody, even the most weak, a chance to survive by not overwhelming your healthcare system, by sort of delaying the onset of the infection for as long as possible, and hoping in the meantime that both vaccines and therapies will emerge that will sort of deal with it. Acquiring herd immunity is ultimately about saying that, look, sooner or later all of us will get it, and the subtext there is, if it's going to be sooner or later, sooner is better than later. So one way of looking at it is to say that flattening the curve is sort of suggesting that later is better than sooner. And even if sooner or later everybody is going to catch it, later is better than sooner because of the problem of survival of the weakest. Acquiring herd immunity, on the other hand, is an argument which fundamentally is about survival of the fittest. So, we may as well all get it over with. And, some of us will sadly, statistically not survive, but that's in the nature of, this particular infection, this particular biomedical threat. So these are binaries 3 and 4 that I really think are quite fascinating if you try to view them from a security studies perspective and try to sort of, unpack them and try to make sense of them. And along with that comes binary 5, which is lockdown versus shelter in place. Now, this is very interesting, Amitabh, because you mentioned China. And I think we've all taken the idea of lockdown from China. In a way, sort of very, by all of us, I mean all of us. I mean, quite literally every other country. China is where the virus arose. China was where the pandemic began. China essentially locked down the city of Wuhan. And we have all in some way, shape or form emulated China. And with a few very notable exceptions, like the UK initially, Sweden. But the notion has been to lock down, which is in effect almost sort of everybody being under some form of house arrest. But there's another term which sadly was not used, which is why I'm presenting it as a binary, which in the initial period, in the first few weeks existed, but then after that, that term kind of disappeared. And that is shelter in place. And the idea of shelter in place is culturally a very different idea from lockdown. It is to say that, wherever you are is probably the safest place for you to be. Don't venture out, and try to, and let us try to make everybody as safe as they can be where they are. The entire logic of lockdown is forcing people to stay where they are. Whereas shelter in place is about a very different kind of dynamic. It's about saying that you are safest where you are. The concept of shelter in place actually comes interestingly from tornadoes in the United States. So in tornado country in the United States, the basic concept is that, if you know there's a tornado warning, and if you can't make it to one of the tornado shelters which are underground, you just shelter in place wherever you are and hope for the best. What you don't do is try to risk getting to a shelter if you know you won't get to there in time. You just shelter in place. So in a very interesting way, I mean, one of the unpacking I'm trying to do is to see whether there's something deeply cultural here or something about nature of state here, that the idea of lockdown, where is the idea of shelter in place? To some extent, it seems to me lockdown is a top-down strategy, shelter in place is a bottom-up strategy. But as I said, I'm still working on this. This is still work in progress, but it strikes me as a really fascinating binary. Then there's another binary which comes from the from sort of what's happening now in cutting-edge biomedical research, and that's the binary between vaccines and therapies. Where do we invest right now? In vaccines or in therapies? In vaccines, we are working towards making sure that, over time, as many people as possible don't catch the infection in the first place. Therapies work on a very different idea. Therapies are working on the idea that those who are symptomatic and who therefore need to be hospitalized, we need to sort of come up with therapeutic solutions to deal with them. Once you have caught COVID-19, how do you sort of deal with COVID-19? So I actually think vaccines and therapies has also been in some way a binary. There's a horn blowing somewhere in the background, so I suppose somebody will have to mute their mic at some stage. Then here's another binary that I find quite fascinating, and that's the binary between experience and innovation. Now, the problem about this particular pandemic is the following. It's not happened before in human memory in this form and shape. So, if you go back to the so-called Spanish flu, even somebody who's a centenarian today, even somebody who's 100 years old today, was a babe in arms when the so-called Spanish flu was raging. And so, in a way, it doesn't matter how old you are. Experience in some ways may potentially be overrated when it comes to dealing with COVID-19. And the simple reason for that is that none of us have this experience. So it's very easy to be critical of states, critical of particular leaderships, critical of particular policies. But this is one of those really gruesome, macabre occasions where, in fact, socially we are learning by doing. And there may be a lot of literature, maybe a lot of theory out there, but it's really happening for the first time. So this binary between experience and innovation, which is just completely breaking free and doing something completely different and unique, I would suggest is a really fascinating binary for us to explore further. Then and linked to this is the binary of tried and trusted versus trial and error. So if we sort of think experience is important, then fundamentally we are saying that there are certain tried and trusted ways, and we need to sort of, to the extent possible, resort to these tried and trusted ways. But the other idea is trial and error, which is that we really don't know what to do next. And so we're going to have to try a bunch of things and see which of those strategies work. And we'll have to then sort of build on what seem at first to be more successful strategies. You can see a version of this, of course, in the clinical trials of vaccines and of therapies. So they are called trials precisely because the possibility of error always exists. But you can always build on a trial, whether successful or unsuccessful. Trial and error really works on a form of what is ultimately natural selection. So it isn't, interestingly, therefore, a form of survival of the fittest. And it seems to me that this is a really, really interesting binary, again, that needs to be, studied and unpacked. And this leads me now to the first of the paradoxes that I want to sort of lay before all of us this morning. And that is this. that we've used the term social distancing a lot, but it seems to me, and I'll just read out and state the paradox as I see it, social distancing is actually physical distancing. The pandemic has simultaneously ruptured existing social ties, strengthened existing weak ties, and created new social connections. So, we call it social distancing, but I'm not actually certain that it is social distancing. It is physical distancing, and that physical distancing actually has led to the creation of new forms of social solidarities also. And I think this is something that those who are interested in sociology really, I think, need to pay greater attention to. What about the second paradox? I find this from a security studies perspective particularly fascinating. So let me just read it out as I have written it. In most existentially threatened contexts, self-sacrifice for the sake of the group is encouraged and celebrated. In the case of this pandemic, self-preservation enhances collective security. It's an amazing paradox, because the whole idea of self-sacrifice is hard written into any kind of discourse of security. An individual sacrificing himself or herself for the larger group. But here, in a way, it's not self-sacrifice that we are seeking. It's self-preservation. That if you can keep yourself safe, you are basically keeping everybody around you safe. Obviously, this doesn't apply to healthcare workers. This doesn't apply to those public officials, who have to sort of function in the first mode. For them, it is still pretty much self-sacrifice. But for most of society, those who aren't on the front lines, as it were, this is a very curious occasion when self-preservation is enhancing collective security. Let's move on from this to kind of the other sort of sets of binaries and paradoxes that I wanted to lay out before all of us this morning, and that relates to existential impacts. What has been the impact of this pandemic? Some really, really fascinating binaries here as well. The most obvious one, it's been with us almost from the beginning, is the binary between life and livelihood. And every time there is there is any kind of talk about ending lockdown, opening up the economy, it's ultimately saying what? It is saying that livelihoods are more important. And if you think about it, this is a classic example of securitization. So, instead of securitizing life, it is livelihoods that are being securitized. So saying that there's an existential threat that is raised, that is posed by shutting down the economy, and society will not survive. The economy will not survive. Individuals will not survive unless we begin to force ourselves to look once again at the whole question of reviving livelihoods. But that's a binary that I put out to you. Another very fascinating binary is the binary between global and local. Some people have, given a particularly Indian twist to it, which is saying that it's not just a binary of global and local, it's a binary of the passport and the ration card. The global is where the threat has come from, the local is where the solutions are being found. And particularly, during lockdown, everybody has realized how important sort of local links are, and so I think that is another binary that is going to be, I suspect, explored a great deal I'm obviously exploring it in the piece I'm writing, but it's going to be explored a great deal by a bunch of social scientists looking at from different disciplinary perspectives. Then, of course, is the binary of the physical and the virtual. And this is, again, I think in some ways a fascinating binary. As we have had physical distancing, we have seen sort of virtual, undistancing. In fact, right now, the fact that I'm interacting with all of you, is a form sort of coming together, of coming closer. So I think that kind of a binary, the binary between the physical and the virtual, is another one that I think is fascinating and that I'm seeking to explore in what I'm writing right now. And then, of course, there's the obvious binary of rich and poor, which has reemerged with full force. Amitabh, you're right in saying that neoliberalism is being fundamentally problematized. Whether this is a death knell of neoliberalism or not, still a bit early to say, but it is being problematized. And, as somebody has very wisely said in this context, it's wrong to say that we are all in the same boat, which is how initially this whole, crisis was characterized. We're all in the same boat. Now, in fact, you could say that actually we are all in very different boats. We are all in the same storm. We're all in the same storm, but we are in different boats. And depending on how we are socioeconomically located, depending quite bluntly on how rich or poor we are, the impact in existential terms is very different. I think it's quite shocking, actually, as a social scientist, that it has taken this pandemic for us to once again focus on this binary of rich and poor. But it also tells you about how powerful neoliberal thinking has been over the last 2 decades, that it's taken something as catastrophic as this to sort of, make us to focus on this binary again. Then there is a particularly cruel binary, the binary of young and old. If ever there was an ageist moment in our society, from the time that we began to use the term ageism, we began to view things, in generational terms, it's now. I mean, this has been, in some ways, an amazing kind of generational moment. For those, for instance, to go back to an earlier binary, who talk about acquiring herd immunity, the point is, when the predators come hunting the herd, it is the old and the weak and the young who get hunted down. And this young old binary, in terms of existential impacts, I think is one of the most cruel binaries that actually exists. And I think it's one that deserves a great deal of analysis and, in fact, thought. Then there's another binary, the binary between being healthy and being comorbid. So individuals who ostensibly look perfectly okay, but if they happen to have a comorbidity, which otherwise does not come in the way of their being, fully functioning members of society, but in this sort of context, suddenly that becomes a very, very critical existential impact. It becomes the difference between being well and being ill. And if you have any comorbidity, fundamentally you are unhealthy, even though you may be completely healthy, in the sense that you may have your comorbidity completely under control. Imagine somebody with who's diabetic, for example. The diabetes may be completely controlled, but at a moment like this, suddenly that comorbidity comes front and center. Then is another one that has, for us in India, been a very painful binary, the binary between local and migrant. The binary between the settled and the mobile. Or as I like to put it, the binary between those who have roots and those who have wings. And I want to put it in those terms because I personally think that sort of, migrants are heroes. I mean, they're heroic figures. A migrant is somebody who removes himself, or in some cases herself, from their environment, the environment in which they are comfortable and settled, and move to vast distances to live in squalid conditions and to earn a livelihood that they share with those back home. That's what a migrant does. These are the people, these are the dreamers, these are the people with wings. And what this, one of the existential impacts here has been precisely on them. Whether your existence was a rooted existence or not has become, I think, one of the great dividing lines. And this, therefore, is what I would present to all of us as binary number 15. And binary number 16, which again is something that has hit us all, like a, really like literally a blow in the solar plexus, is the binary between Homo sapiens and other forms of life. Which you could also conceive of as kind of a binary between society and nature, or culture and nature, if you want. But it's I think a really powerful binary. And at least in the early days of the lockdown, there was a lot of stuff coming out, and a lot of science coming out about how quickly, in fact, when human beings disappear, other life forms, both sort of vegetable and animal, sort of reemerge. How plant and animal life just reemerges as soon as human beings are absent from a particular locale. So I think that's another binary, and I think those who are interested, who are focused on understanding international relations or indeed society from an environmental perspective will have a lot to do with trying to unpack this particular binary. Another binary, which I'm still working on, and I'm not sure how this is going to pan out in my writing about this, but obviously it's a very obvious binary between indoors and outdoors. But I'm also wondering whether this is a binary which in some ways, is about private versus public, also about the domus versus the polis. So I won't say very much more about that, because this is a part of the paper I haven't started really working on yet myself. But I lay it out. It's a very obvious binary, and it does sort of obviously have a huge impact. Then, of course, there's a binary between the social and the psychological. The binary between the outer world that all of us inhabit and the inner world that all of us inhabit. We know the deep psychological impact that this has had on so many different individuals. And so that's another binary for us to explore. Going along with it is another binary, which is that of isolation and connection. We have been, many of us, physically isolated, but that physical isolation has led to some amazing new connections. And some of those are reconnections. We have reconnected with people, but some of them are brand new connections. So I think right there, there is something for us to explore. To what extent do we need to have a certain degree of physical isolation for us to be able to actually build some of those really important connective tissues that ultimately sort of, are as important to society as sort of, physical proximity. And also for those of us who are interested in the knowledge building side of things, which means basically all of us, there's a binary of collaboration versus contemplation, which I think again has emerged as in some ways a kind of existential impact. If you're sitting in a research, you're not going to, discover a vaccine. You're not going to discover an effective therapy working in isolation. So collaboration and collaborative ways of working, collaborative ways of intellectual endeavor, obviously sort of there, as one of the impacts of this pandemic. But so I will suggest is contemplation. I think a lot of people, as they have sort of withdrawn within themselves, have found new dimensions and new depths. And I don't just mean this in a metaphysical sense. I mean this in a very much an intellectual sense. Beginning to focus on what, from an intellectual point, really matters to them. This leads me to the third of the paradoxes that I will lay out before you, and that is this. Globalization has been weakened by its own success, perhaps permanently. As global vectors of infection emerged, the first casualties were global supply and value chains and mass human travel. I really do think that this is a fascinating paradox. Uh, you know, just as Karl Marx sort of and Frederick Engels wrote about capitalism, containing within itself the seeds of its eventual demise. That the very success of capitalism, Marx and Engels told us, would ultimately lead to the capitalism as a system of economic production, as well as social production, would lead its collapse. So in an interesting way is globalization being weakened by its own success. And the fact that a lot of us have realized the extent to which, even for the most simple things, we depend on global value chains. And I think it's quite obvious already that, this is going to be one of those enduring impacts, but I'll say a little bit more about it in a while. Here's another paradox. Globalization in its contemporary form has been based on a shared bedrock of transportation and communication technologies. Yet the pandemic has been catastrophic for one and hugely empowering for the other. So, when we talked about contemporary globalization, it was based on the notion of mass travel, and it was based on a notion, obviously, of the internet, of virtual connectivity. And what this pandemic has done, it has completely destroyed one whole technology, perhaps again forever, which is the technologies related to mass travel and transportation. Actually, travel and transportation are two very different things. I haven't got into that in this, because travel is fundamentally about human beings. Transportation is about goods. And so over time, transportation will reemerge, but will mass travel reemerge? That's the question. And when it comes to services, all services are migrating, to communication technologies now. All are, including, our own service. Education is moving to, to sort of to virtual platforms, to digital platforms, and that's I think a change that is going to continue. Okay, that leaves me, Amitabh, with only the final section, which is where I sort of, talk a bit about, and I've titled it deliberately, and indeed I have even in the article, this section is titled exactly like this: tentative predictions about uncertain outcomes. Because I do think that these are at this stage of writing tentative predictions, and the outcomes are uncertain. But in the last two sections, I really talked about the present. This section is about the future. Would you, at this stage, Amitabh, like to come in and say something, or should I carry on?
I think, Varun, you just carry on. How much time do you think you will take with this section? 10 minutes?
About 5 minutes, I think.
Okay, perfect. So
I'm almost done.
Great. Why don't you just continue?
I'm almost done. So let me carry on with this section then, as you suggest. Well, first of all, and Amitabh, you talked about this in terms of stigmatization in your early remarks. And I think you're absolutely right. There is here a kind of another binary, the 21st that I'm laying out for all of you, which is the binary between COVID-19 positive and COVID-19 negative. At this moment, obviously, the moment you're COVID-19 positive, you are a source of infection, and so on and so forth. So positive is seen in a negative light, and being COVID-19 negative is seen, as it were, in a positive light. But I suspect, thinking about the future, that this is going to change. And a time may come when, if you have the antibodies, if the serum test indicates that you have the antibodies, that's going to be positive. So if you're COVID-19 positive, that's going to be positive. And if you're COVID-19 negative, you're going to be incredibly vulnerable. Do not discount the possibility that international travel in the future will involve, for example, a stamp in your passport certifying that you are, either COVID-19 positive or COVID-19 negative. And in fact, it may only be people who are COVID-19 positive in the sense of having antibodies who may be allowed to travel. And so, there are a bunch of really, really important issues there. Thinking about sort of, the way in which the international system is going to evolve when it comes to, the future. And I mean, not just the absolutely immediate future, but sort of, looking ahead over the short and medium term. So that is one thing. Another binary, of course, and this is one that I think a lot of us are trying to get our heads around, is a kind of status quo ante or business as usual or back to the future versus this being an inflection point or a new normal, or as somebody has recently characterized it in a meeting I attended, a next normal. So they're saying don't even talk about new normals now because we're going to have so many new normals coming one after the other that it's better to talk about the next normal rather than the new normal. I think that's a really interesting point conceptually. But I think this binary, the one between, the going, back to the future, business as usual, status quo ante, versus the understanding of this as an inflection point, as that something fundamental is going to change after this. This takes me back to 9/11, by the way, and at that time, the feeling that had fundamentally transformed world politics forever. Well, it turned out that it hadn't, ultimately world politics pretty much remained what it was. And I think everybody basically got accustomed, individuals and societies and states and corporations, everybody got accustomed to living with the possibility of catastrophic mass terrorism and carried on with their lives. So that argument is the argument that ultimately business as usual will reemerge. But the contrary argument is that no, this really truly is an inflection point. And that in any case is what I'm presenting here as a binary. And, the last of the paradoxes that I am sort of exploring, and I'm still trying to figure out whether it truly is a paradox or not. I'll even say that quite clearly, which is this, that as soon as globalization becomes the source of an existential threat, the sovereign territorial state has reasserted itself. All responses to the pandemic have been geographically circumscribed within national borders. This strikes me as extremely powerful. That the sovereign territorial state, I would suspect, is going to emerge much more powerful, much more present, I dare say omnipresent, given the new technologies of surveillance that exist, from the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is, of course, something which, for those of us in international relations, is really worth exploring. What about the two most powerful countries in the international system? I wanted to end by focusing a bit on sort of, international politics, because ultimately that is what we do in CPOD. So, and this is really, I won't be taking more than another couple of minutes, I don't think. For China, COVID-19 has been a massive crisis of credibility. I would suggest that to you, that a massive crisis of credibility. And as China, builds its sort of kind of iconic kind of projects, I even ask, I wonder whether, the BRI can survive the COVID-19 pandemic. Although China will do its utmost to ensure that it survives. But really, truly speaking, I mean, can the Belt and Road Initiative survive this? I think China's credibility has taken a truly global hit. And this kind of image, China and Africa, China was already being distrusted in Africa. Many of you would be aware that all of the African ambassadors accredited to Beijing collectively protested about the stigmatization of African students in China at the height of the pandemic. I think some fundamental fissures have emerged here. And I want to link this, in fact, to China's domestic politics, because I would suggest that, the current leadership of China, specifically Xi Jinping, is really a huge problem for China. Because in the post-Deng period, China had evolved this very neat kind of decadal transfer of power between generations within the Chinese Communist Party. All carefully choreographed and so on. Obviously, the choreography containing within itself very, very brutal power struggles within the Politburo, so on. But nevertheless, Jiang Zemin, 1993 to 2003, Hu Jintao, 2003 to 2013, Xi Jinping, 2013 to when? I mean, does anybody seriously believe that Xi Jinping is going to go in 2023? I seriously doubt it. Could well stay on. And there's an alternate view, which is Xi Jinping may actually go well before 2023. But anyway, that's what I mean about the crisis of credibility when it comes to China. When it comes to the United States, I would see this as a crisis of coherence. A crisis of coherence. And I think that's just as grievous an injury to a great power as the lack of credibility is. So the lack of coherence and lack of credibility are the two biggest points of weakness when it comes to being a great power. And the causes for the crisis of coherence in the United States, obviously I'll just very briefly go through them with you, so that to explain the depth of the incoherence, the lack of coherence right now. So I think 4 factors taken together explain the high degree of incoherence in the US in facing up to the COVID-19 pandemic. First is the capitalist and litigious nature of the US healthcare system. So they really don't have, in a very serious sense, a public health system. The US has a wonderful, publicly funded, medical research, biomedical research system. But that's very different from, the healthcare system itself. Also a robust federal system rooted in political history, popular culture, and constitutional law that makes it very difficult in the United States to have national responses. The third factor is an extremely polarized political system in which even existential crises do not produce a common ground. And the fourth is a deeply ingrained self-image of individual entitlement and self-reliance. That sense of, I did it my way, that deeply kind of engaged, the deep aspect of American culture. So what does this all lead to? This leads to the final point. I mean, I may be wrong here, but my sense is that the international system is now entering uncharted territory. I do not believe that we are going to get to, a kind of a, back to the future, business as usual kind of system that easily. I will stop now, Amitabh, and
Thank you.
Also to sort of facilitate the discussion, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yes, please.
And get back to the video mode.
Yes, please. As soon as you do that, first of all, I think, Varun, I think that was a brilliant presentation. And thank you very much for sparing the time. In some ways, one of the paradoxes of the situation that we're facing is that perhaps it may not have been possible. Could you please mute your audios, please? Mr. Adi is not muted, so please mute your audio. So one of the paradoxes is that perhaps in normal times or in pre-COVID-19 times, it may not have been possible to find the time to have such an engaging conversation virtually. As you pointed out, in some ways, physical distancing has led to a sense of anomie where you want to be more socially and intellectually connected. And certainly the number of seminars, lectures that I have participated in over the last 3.5 months of lockdown have been perhaps more than I have done over the last decade. For the benefit of your further reflection as you finalize your paper, one of the seminars that we held earlier is perhaps could be added to the paradoxes that you pointed out, was that when we need multilateralism much, much more in every shape and form, we have lost faith in multilateralism. And that's not just the WHO. I think Dr. Negi is here, Archana is here. She's pointed out the huge collapse of faith in the WTO system. But when we need multilateralism, multilateralism is its weakest. Second is a paradox, is that while territorial sovereignty, borders hardening, a return to Westphalia may seem a logical consequence of what has been happening, what you also see is that there are states which are completely, and that flows from really multilateralism, is states that are unmanageable in terms of being able to control pandemics. It has brought to light the fact that countries like Australia and New Zealand, in contrast to countries like India, are able to manage. And so is there a view of how states are more manageable states within territorial frontiers that will emerge out of this crisis? Within the private and the public, I think you brought it out very clearly, but I think there are clearly, when you live in a millennial city like Gurgaon, you begin to see the nexus between the private and the public and the thin boundaries vanishing, as indeed is the distinctions between, there isn't a rich-poor binary in that sense. Frankly, there is this great, I think Iqbal made it in the context of the Muslim prayer where he says, Jab aaya waqt-e namaz, ek hi saf mein ho gaye Mahmood o Ayaz. There was no distinction between slave and master when it came to the moment of prayer. In some ways, unless you own a jet plane and you have an island in the Pacific, we're all in the same situation, especially in a millennial city like Gurgaon, where you have to be careful whether your health is in your interests, as you I think pointed out in a different context. But I think overall, frankly, Varun, I couldn't agree more with the conclusions of your presentation that we are in uncharted territory. And while 9/11 did suggest a similar epistemological and historical rupture in our thinking and in our actions, perhaps, and I hope that in some ways that transition is, or that rupture is as ephemeral as 9/11 seems in contrast today. When you look at it, you think that that 9/11 was just an event rather than a major rupture. And let's hope that we get a vaccine. I mean, if we do get a vaccine and it's universally accessible and affordable, what would that do? Of course, apart from Rumsfeld, it was Bill Gates who had actually identified this as something that was going to happen. But what happens if tomorrow, curiously speaking, skeptical as I am, but cautious in my remarks, given that I'm not given to litigation, that Baba Ramdev has emerged as providing a solution. Suppose the solution did work miraculously. What would What would that do to our way of thinking about this pandemic? Now, I have time. I know, Varun, there are lots and lots of people who are demanding your attention, especially because you're away from Delhi. But for this Ghar Wapsi, as it were, I think everyone wants a bit of your time and attention. But what I would seek your indulgences is if I could actually just speak to I would just read out a couple, or you could read out the chat and pick on a couple of questions and think and answer them in the next 2-3 minutes. But I know Pooja has been reminding me that she spent time on that video, which she wants to share with everyone about this latest student initiative called Mandala. Pooja, now if you can do it in 2 minutes, it's great. Otherwise, we're going back to Professor Sahni.
Okay, sir, I'm doing it right away, muting myself.
Varun, may I also ask you if, on behalf of the Pooja, congratulations, first of all, and I'll ask you on Pooja's behalf, Varun, if there are students and scholars and faculty who might be interested in collaborating with students and scholars from JNU on this initiative, that would be very, very welcome. And may I now request you to make your final comments based on some of the issues highlighted in the chat, and then we'll come back finally to thank you and to thank Abhishek, and we'll conclude the session within about 10 minutes or so. Varun.
Well, thanks for that, Amitabh. Congratulations again. It's nice to see, the student initiative with the Mandala. I hope it's successful. It's I think we now have the possibility to do amazing work, and I think getting a kind of a research magazine, a research journal for students to get into the habit of writing is, I think, extremely important. But let me sort of start off with your comments. And there was one question in the chat as well, which links to what your last remarks were, Amitabh, which is this on paradox 5. Does it mean that we might witness a resurgence of Westphalian sovereignty, that the neoliberals, international institutions, and globalization had so systemically weakened? What will it mean for multilateralism? My sense is yes. My sense is that we are going to see a re-emergence of some form of Westphalian sovereignty. Maybe we should stop using the term Westphalia and start using some other way to characterize it. But yes, I think the sovereign territorial state is alive and well and kicking. And everything that we've seen in this pandemic suggests to us that when when push comes to shove, when the chips are down, we turn to our governments to help us. And we judge our governments based on whether they're able to help us or not. So that would, suggest that, ultimately, both sovereignty and territoriality remain extremely important. And if you concatenate to this other developments that have been taking place, there, apart from environmentalism, I struggle to think of any other really powerful kind of, ideology or thought system that, is based on anything other than, the sovereign territorial state. So, if you look at the rise of hyper-nationalism in China, for example, you look at what's happening in the United States, I dare say in our own country, but also you look at what's happening about other attempts to sort of overcome sovereign territoriality. So, for example, the European Union and the fundamental weakening of the European Union. So I think that there are reasons why we really need to get back and try to understand what sovereign territoriality is and what it truly means in these times when technologically we are all globally interconnected and nothing remains secret for long. So, so these are not impermeable borders by any manner of means. In fact, they're borders that can be, that are deeply permeable. And there are asymmetries of permeability as well, which is another point that we must not forget, who is looking at whom is a very critical question. In feminist scholarship, we have a lot of insights about the male gaze. And the male gaze is precisely about the fact that, the one who looks is the one who has the power. And the one who's looked upon is the one who is weak in that particular power equation. And I think, we therefore, need to use some of these other bodies of theory to interrogate realism. I think that's extremely important for us to do. But the fact that we're interrogating realism should not lead us facilely to assume that in some ways sovereign territoriality as the core organizing principle of world politics, frankly, has been sidelined. And I think what would be really interesting to see, in the weeks and months and years ahead is what's going to happen to the multinational corporation as a kind of a core actor in world politics. And I think on that, I suspect that you're going to find MNCs are going to be facing unprecedented challenges. You talked about the vaccine, Amitabh, and you're absolutely right. But imagine a vaccine that's effective but incredibly expensive, as happened with the kind of the whole the therapeutic kind of package for HIV/AIDS, the antiretroviral package for HIV/AIDS. It can have a devastating impact. Again, I like the insight that COVID-19 has presented to all of us, that we may be in the same storm, but we aren't all in the same boat. What's our boat? Our boat, if you are a student of international politics, our boat is still the sovereign territorial state, and that's the point. It's at moments of storm, it's when the sea is at its most choppy, that we wish we were traveling on a boat that was large and stable and secure. And we wish our governments to be, no matter how anti-statist we may otherwise be, no matter how anarchist we may otherwise be. It's at moments of pandemic and such sorts of existential crises that we turn back upon our governments and upon the state. It's just sort of worth keeping that in mind. So your question about multilateralism, and it's been asked in the chat as well, this is a very valid question. But, here's the WHO, this amazing international organization, this amazing specialized agency of the United Nations that did so much, for global health, that did so much to eliminate smallpox. What a magnificent achievement that was. And look what it has become, a handmaiden of a particular state. So, this should not surprise us. After all, it's an intergovernmental organization. But the extent to which the WHO in the initial period of this pandemic articulated the statist positions, of China, and specifically the positions of the Chinese Communist Party, was really scary. I don't know what this is going to mean. Some are suggesting that this is going to lead to us to re-examine the nature of intergovernmentality itself. What does it mean to be an intergovernmental organization? But I would much rather see this as just being a classic example of power transition. That you have the slow but inevitable decline of the systemic hegemon, the United States, and you have only at this moment one challenger to that systemic hegemony, and that challenger is now sort of no longer, in Deng Xiaoping's words, building their capabilities and biding their time, but they're now sort of out there in sort of in rampant aggressive mode. So I mean, it's very easy to sort of, if you are so inclined, to see this entirely in terms of realism. I mean, you could come up with a really, really good realist analysis of what's been going on, with regards to COVID-19. I'm not suggesting that everybody sort of, listening to me has to do that. In fact, in a place like CPOD, and to others interested in international relations, I hope that sort of we'll be looking at these issues from a wide variety of theoretical perspectives. But let's not say that realism has run its course. I'm not saying that anybody in today's discussion has said that, but that has been sort of, so one of the ways of looking at it is say, well, when the pandemic arrived, no country could sort of prevent it. Well, actually, strictly speaking, that's not true. Many countries were able to come up with strategies that minimized the pandemic. Many countries were. Within the country, within our own country, many states have been way more successful than others. So we have a comparative kind of public policy, possibility right here in our country itself. I'm located in Goa, and for the first 2 months of the pandemic, our stats were 7070. 7 cases, no active cases, 7 recoveries, no deaths, and of the 7 cases, 4 were for foreign tourists. All were from outside, and Goa had successfully done it. Look at Kerala. So, I mean, I could go on about this, but my point is, I think COVID-19 and this experience should do 2 things for us. I hope so, intellectually. One, lead us to begin to, whatever the issue area is that concerns us, to begin to sort of, look seriously at pandemics, not just in the way in which fashions come in, but look at it and really ask questions of a fundamental nature, about sort of the international system, about world politics and all the rest of it. That's one thing that I hope will happen. The second thing I hope will happen is a real discussion and dialogue between different theoretical positions. Because, international relations is a discipline which does not have any longer a single hegemonic theoretical position. It just doesn't. And if we are to be a discipline, despite all of the influences we get, from other sister disciplines and indeed from the natural sciences, I do believe that we do need to, in the light of COVID-19, carry on with that theoretical endeavor. And I hope this time we won't get caught into the trench warfare of traditional security versus, non-traditional security, which happened after the Cold War, which was people taking positions, and I hope it's more intellectually fertile than that.
Thank you.
I think just Amitabh, if you allow me to stop at this point. When lots more could be said. I've been looking at the chat box, and there's so many interesting comments there. But I think let me stop, because I think we're also getting to the time when people need to go and have lunch. And I, for one, am still trying to run a university remotely, and I, after lunch, have a university to run. So unless there's something else, I think I'll certainly stop speaking at this point.
I think we have developed a protocol, but otherwise, I think some of my colleagues will bear me out. People used to have lunch while participating in the seminar. So we've made it now obligatory that certain norms which are otherwise taken for granted in real seminars will continue in webinars, which is that you maintain a dress code and you do not eat or drink while participating in the webinar. But thank you, Varun, again for sparing so much of your time for this webinar. As you can see, that there's this great appetite for IR theory more generally, but also I think provoked by this pandemic. Fortunately, JNU is one of those places which, despite the protestations of various quarters, has managed to control and contain the infection. I think there's only one confirmed case of a pharmacist. Otherwise, there's no, there is no one else on campus who has been tested positive. However, as that Swedish scientist who is the mother of the herd immunity theory said, I would like to see what happens when people stop the lockdown. So once JNU reopens, I hope that sense of resilience continues, or we have developed a vaccine by then. But let me thank you all, including I noticed Rashid Raina, who reminded me that he wrote one of the initial theses on pandemics and security. At that stage, he didn't have much material, but you can be sure that if you were to write a doctoral thesis today, Rashid, and take a study leave from your administrative career, you'll be overwhelmed by the material available. Thank you all my colleagues. Next week, we have another seminar, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Abhishek to tell you all about it. But students and scholars of CPOD, please attend. I can see Vaishnavi. Vaishnavi, I can see that you come here for your supervisor, but I wish that you came here for every one of our webinars. Okay, and all the other students and scholars, I would encourage you. I know you've been coming in great numbers, but please continue because a lot of effort does go into organizing all this, as you can imagine. And may I now request Dr. Abhishek to say his final words, while thanking you, Abhishek, for all the effort that you put into this organization of the seminar. And thank Varun again for sparing so much time. Abhishek, we can't hear you. I think one of the are you working from a phone? Okay. Abhishek, we can't still hear you. We'll give you 1 more minute to try and connect. Can't hear you. Can anyone hear him? No.
No, we
No,
can't hear him.
I can't hear him at all. No,
Okay, okay. That's
I
fine.
can't hear Abhishek.
Yes, sir, we hear you.
Abhishek, if we can't hear you, may I just thank on your behalf everyone who has helped you with the organization of this webinar, including the challenges that we continue to face with technology. But next week, I understand that there is a seminar on various tracks of diplomacy. As I've already told you about the 8th of July seminar, and I look forward, both of us look forward to your presence. And Varun, we'll make sure that you get invites for all our seminars. And Pooja, thank you very much for your effort. Abhishek, can you? No. Okay. Thank you so much, Abhishek. It was I have thanked everyone on your behalf as well. Thank you, all of you. And look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. All of you.